This seminar is dedicated to the Eightfold Path. Those of you familiar with Buddhism will, of course, be quite aware of what the Eightfold Path is. Those of you less familiar with Buddhism have the great advantage of not having that information. So you can start from scratch, and you don't have to unlearn anything that Buddhism has taught you. This secular approach to the Dharma, and as you might notice, I prefer to think in terms of a secular approach to the Dharma rather than to Buddhism. And I probably will use the word Dharma more. It's a difficult term to translate, but as you get used to hearing it, it'll start making more sense, maybe. We have to live with this idea, even though it doesn't, it's not an equivalent word in English or in German. Roughly speaking, we can think of Dharma as the teachings of the Buddha, very, very loosely. But the word Dharma is also used to describe what those teachings are about. So it's not just the doctrines or the concepts, but it's also what those doctrines and concepts come to be when we put them into practice. And that's called the practice of the Dharma. No need to go any further on that right now, but in our discussion periods, we can work towards getting greater clarification about some of these terms. As I said yesterday, but I think it's probably worth repeating, we have 6 seminars, 2 each day, today, tomorrow, and on Saturday. And in each seminar, I will cover one block of virtues, I would like to call them. The 4 mindfulnesses, the 4 efforts, and so on. If you're unfamiliar with all this, don't worry. I'm going to go through it quite slowly and systematically. And I'm more interested in creating a kind of a sense of what this practice is about, rather than going into lots of scholarly detail and analysis of Sanskrit words. I'm very tempted to do that because I like doing that and I'm fairly good at it, but it's also a way to remove us from the actuality of what's happening in our lives. This is not a theoretical philosophy, it's a practical philosophy. It's something that we do, it's not something that we try to convince ourselves of as true. The real question is not, is that true? Is that right? The question that concerns us on this retreat is, does this work? Is this effective? Does it introduce some good into my life, the world? Questions of truth, I think, are secondary. So the Eightfold Path, we're going to start with the Eightfold Path, and then I'll come back to go through each of these different groups of qualities. But you'll see, I think, why, to understand the Eightfold Path, we need to prepare ourselves with a certain understanding of the broad perspective that Gautama, the Buddha, laid out. And we can now try to understand for ourselves and to make our own, in our own time, in our own lives, a way of living more fully. To borrow a Christian metaphor, the Eightfold Path is the alpha and the omega of the Dharma. It's the A and the Z. It's the beginning and the end. And I mean that in some senses quite literally. If we look at the early Buddhist discourses, we find at the very beginning of the very first discourse, Gautama announces, I have found a middle way. This is supposedly the first thing he said. I have found a middle way. Eine mittlere Weg. And what is that middle way? It is this noble Eightfold Path. So a middle way is also, of course, a path. And that path can be expanded into 8 distinct areas of life. Now, we're not actually going to get into the details of those 8 areas of life until Saturday afternoon, our final seminar here. But we will nonetheless find that most of these 8 aspects of the Eightfold Path appear kind of everywhere. They'll appear in the idea of mindfulness, meditation, and so forth and so on, and effort. They're all there in the Eightfold Path too. But before we start even beginning to explore the detail of this process, let's first of all ask ourselves what a path is. It's an Eightfold Path, a middle way. Again, we use this expression very naturally today. We talk about, I'm looking for a spiritual path. People say, my path involves compassion, we might say. We say Buddhism is not a religion, it's a way of life. A way, again, ein Weg. But what is a path? We've all, from the moment we were able to walk until now, we've been using paths, roads, streets, footpaths. They're so fundamental to our human experience that we tend not to notice what is characteristic of a path. We think of it as just, well, where is the path to Heidelberg? Where is the road to Heidelberg? Oh, it's over there. Let's go. Off we go. If we stop for a moment and think about this, we might find that this slightly vague, but nonetheless very inspiring idea of being on a path, of finding one's way, can break down into at least 3 different areas. And it's helpful when thinking about what a path is to actually remember your own experience, perhaps, of walking in the hills, walking through the forest. And when you're walking on a path and you're, in a way, getting into your rhythm, your pace, and enjoying that pace, then what is it that allows that movement to take place? The first thing is that when we're on a path, we have a confidence that it's going to take us somewhere. It has a destination. And I found a useful way to think about this is to remember those moments we've had while walking. When we get lost, we're walking along happily in a nice Swiss mountain or something, and then suddenly we realize the path is gone. I don't know if you've had that experience. I have. Happens all the time. I can even do it in the middle of a big city. Lose my way. Now, in the countryside, it's perhaps easier to understand this metaphor. And of course, that at the Buddha's time would have been the sort of paths they would have used, not highways and Autostrade, but footpaths, probably created by animals originally. So when you lose the path, you lose your sense of direction. You very quickly can't remember whether we're going that way or going that way. When there's no path, there's no orientation. So a crucial feature of treading a path is this sense that we know that we're going somewhere. Even if we don't know where it goes, doesn't really matter. We can be confident that it'll get us somewhere. And if you're lost, that's enough. You're going to get somewhere where there's going to be other people. So being on a path, metaphorically, means having a clear sense, or at least some sense, of where your life is heading, of what matters for you most in life, and how you might get there, how you might realize that. The second dimension of being on a path is that you can move along a path without any obstruction or impediment. What's so joyful about a country trail is that you can move through the landscape without having to climb over trees or go through river beds. Everything is open, unobstructed, free of any blockage. And that means that you can find your own rhythm and pace. There's a kind of a naturalness in our movement once we're on a path. And when we hit an obstacle, let's say a tree's fallen across the path, suddenly we're stuck. Suddenly we can't move anymore. And at those moments, we then realize what it was like to be moving towards a destination. There's a sense of fulfillment, a sense of flourishing, a sense of feeling good in oneself that one is on one's way. And the third element of a path is that it is connecting us to a community. This is particularly true of footpaths, because a footpath is basically just a space that's been created by the tread of other people's feet. You might be completely alone in the wilderness. You can't see anybody. But if a path is snaking through the landscape, you can be confident that other people have been there and they have kept it open for you, not you personally, but for others. And if the path doesn't get used for a year or two, it disappears. The grass grows up, things happen, and what was once a lovely little path, literally has gone. So this also points out to the fact that what is essential to a path, is that it is an emptiness. There's nothing there. There's just the absence of trees and grasses and rocks and ravines that get in the way. Once you clear those away, you have a free, open space in which you can move. And that free, open space is created by those who have gone before you. And at the same time, when you tread that path, you keep it open for those who will come after you. So you're playing your own part in keeping this path active by the simple movement of your own feet. So it might be worth bearing in mind through our time together to keep coming back to this core idea. Eightfold Path is a path. The middle way is a way. And what is that, existentially about, to be on a way, to be on a path? Now, the Eightfold Path, as we can see from our roadmap, is the outcome of a much more complex process in which it is embedded. And if you look at the roadmap, you'll see I've broken it down into 4 paths, 4 tasks. And each of these paths or tasks is then broken up further, as we're going to be seeing. So these 4 tasks or these 4 paths are not existing independently one from the other, but they perform a function of leading from one path to the next, to the next, to the next. And these we can think of as themselves as 4 paths, as you'll see on the roadmap, but each path is characterized by a particular kind of activity, a particular kind of task. So let me just quickly go through these 4 tasks just by naming them. And then this afternoon, we'll go into that in far more detail. The first task is to embrace life. In a more technical translation, comprehend suffering. But I'm going to try and avoid Buddhist terminology. I understand this as our capacity to embrace our life. How we embrace that life is then spelled out by the 4 mindfulnesses, the 4 efforts, and the 4 bases of creativity. And we'll take each of those as a block for a seminar. Today, we're just going to cover the 4 mindfulnesses. So if we look at it in this sort of picture, the Eightfold Path is what emerges from the seeing the stopping of reactivity, which is the 3rd task, which emerges from the 2nd task of letting go of reactivity, which emerges from the 1st task of embracing life. Again, that may not be totally clear. This is shorthand for something quite complex, but effectively we embrace life or embrace this situation we're in. We let go of what we consider to be negative or self-defeating, neurotic mental habits. As they die down, we come to see the absence or the stopping of that kind of reactivity. There's an inner clarity and stillness. And it's from that inner clarity and stillness that the possibility of the Eightfold Path emerges. So we can't really understand the Eightfold Path experientially without seeing what are the conditions that enable it to come about. We're going to keep coming back to these points, so don't worry if it's a little bit vague and confusing at this point. You'll also notice that on each path or each task, you have a cluster of virtues or mental or states of mind, however we prefer to think of that. And we'll see that the same terms appear in different groups. We'll see mindfulness, for example, appears everywhere. Effort or variations on effort appear in different clusters. Concentration is another one. So what this points to is that the practice we're doing, even if it's a simple practice like mindfulness, in fact, requires different elements to work together. So when we practice mindfulness, even in something like MBSR for working on a, let's say, anxiety or something, yes, we need to be mindful, we need to be attentive, but we also need to be focused. We also need to be relatively equanimous. We also need a certain stillness in our bodies. We need to be awake rather than half asleep. We need a brightness of mind. So what these clusters of qualities describe is a sort of complete human state of consciousness, which is characterized by different elements. But as we go through each one, we'll begin to see more clearly what that means. It's worth pointing out that the mindfulness is the single quality that we find in each of the four tasks. We find it in the Eightfold Path, we find it in the 7 facets of awakening, we find it in the 5 faculties, and we find it amongst the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And this, I think, does point to the fact that mindfulness is absolutely central to the process. And this, I think, is a great affirmation of mindfulness being used in therapeutic work, for example. It's not as though mindfulness is a sort of a minor secondary aspect of meditation that the Buddha mentioned once or twice. It's actually right at the very core of the whole practice of the Dharma, both in how we come to terms with our experience, life itself, in terms of how we let go of what holds us back, in terms of how we hold the experience of stopping, and how we cultivate mindfulness as we walk along the Eightfold Path as well. So mindfulness is a core element. And the ability to transform it into therapy, I think, suggests that therapy, again, is potentially comparable to the practice of the Dharma itself. I had a conversation with John Kabat-Zinn some years ago, and he said for him, MBSR is pure Dharma. He may not put that in his books, but that's how he understands it. That he's distilled in the idea of mindfulness the whole complex set of practices that constitute the Eightfold Path, basically. The discourse the Buddha gave on mindfulness, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, actually says in its opening paragraph, mindfulness is the only way to Nirvana. That's what it says. Mindfulness is the only way to Nirvana. Usually that's translated as mindfulness is the direct way to Nirvana, which is also fine. But again, it points to the fact that mindfulness is concerned with what, for many Buddhists, is the summum bonum, the highest good, the experience of Nirvana itself. And I don't think this is Buddhist propaganda. Mindfulness is amazing, it gets you everywhere. It's actually, I think, a fairly matter-of-fact observation. Because Nirvana is basically a non-reactive state of mind. And as soon as we start practicing mindfulness, in whatever context, we learn to stop and look In other words, to not react to what's going on in our mind, but to stabilize ourselves in such a way that we can just see what's going on inside our minds. So if we have, let's say, problems with anxiety, very often the reason anxiety is a problem is because it takes hold of us and we can't do anything about it. And it overwhelms us and it makes us feel awful and worried. By using mindfulness as an intervention here, we're basically opening up a gap between anxiety, the thoughts and the worries and the bodily feelings, and our consciousness or awareness of the anxiety. And that's the function of mindfulness. Mindfulness basically allows us to become conscious of the fact that we're anxious or depressed, whatever it is. And then we can begin to work another relationship, work on developing another relationship with our experience. It's not about getting rid of anxiety, suppressing anxiety. It's about learning to be with it in such a way that it loses its power over us, even when it's still around. So to say that mindfulness is the direct way to nirvana is basically saying mindfulness is where the experience of nirvana begins. And by nirvana, and again, we have all sorts of funny ideas about nirvana, most of which come from Buddhism. Nirvana is just the stopping of reactivity. It's as simple as that. But on Saturday morning, we'll look at that in much greater detail. So if mindfulness, is this central feature of this practice, then how might we go about developing it? And what different aspects of mindfulness might we find? Mindfulness, again, is it's not just one thing. It depends upon what we are mindful of. But basically, this project to try to live our lives from a non-reactive awareness requires a fair amount of training, a fair amount of time, to commit oneself to actually developing these capacities within us. We might think of mindfulness as a muscle of the body that we haven't really used very much. So it's like with the physical body. You need to train that muscle and you need to use that muscle in order that it can then serve you more effectively. So mindfulness, likewise, it's something that needs to be trained and strengthened, something which we can become more attuned to, aligned with in our lives. And perhaps the simplest way to describe mindfulness initially is something like paying close attention to what is going on. Paying close attention. Paying close attention. Which, of course, is something we do anyway. But usually we pay close attention to things that we find particularly interesting or particularly beautiful or we're particularly attached to. There we have no trouble paying close attention. In fact, the object seems to sort of suck us in to its energy field, and we're fascinated, like a deer looking into the headlights of a car. It's much more difficult to pay close attention to things that are not intrinsically very interesting. For example, the breath. or the sensations in the body that just come and go, or the sound of the wind outside. That these are things that don't normally engage our attention. We've got more important things to do than watch our breath or listen to the wind in the leaves. At least we think we do. So mindfulness is very much a practice of learning to pay attention to what is generally not very interesting. And the magic of mindfulness, as Thich Nhat Hanh once called it, the magic of mindfulness is to transform what appears to be ordinary into something extraordinary. And we might find that the course of our time just on this short retreat, as the mind becomes a little bit more still, we start paying closer attention to our breath, to our body, to whatever is going on, that actually starts to render the most ordinary and banal things as strangely, somehow more interesting. We might find that after a session of sitting in meditation, we go out into the garden, say, and we can be, as it were, almost enraptured by the color of the leaves, particularly at this time of year. The beautiful changing from green to yellow to brown to red to orange. And of course, we often think, oh, isn't that lovely? But we might find that when the mind gets even more still and focused, we can find ourselves contemplating a leaf, a single leaf on the ground, with a kind of almost a sense of wonder, which again we'll come back to as we continue. So mindfulness is not just a kind of mechanical activity of keep bringing the mind back again and again and again to the breath. That's the training. But the effect over time is that it renders our whole consciousness and awareness somehow more bright, radiant, alive, present, in which not only the beautiful things like autumn leaves become more intense, but just the everyday experience of being alive itself, which we take for granted so much that we forget what an extraordinary thing it is to be alive at all. In purely in basic scientific terms, it's taken billions of years for simple forms of life to evolve into complex mammalian creatures like us, and who have this this incredible capacity of consciousness and language. That's our humanity in so many ways. So it's odd in a way that we can kind of forget, or we forget that. We forget that we are, as it were, the culmination of millions of years of evolution, of increasing refinement and complexity. And here we are in this moment. And instead of being completely amazed and astonished, we're bored. We look at our watch and think, oh, I've got another half an hour to go before I can do something really interesting, like having a cup of coffee. I know I'm joking, but it's not actually a joke. I think it's a very, very strange state of affairs that we find ourselves in. Of course, it's sometimes we're shaken out of this kind of complacency and this tedium of daily life by, let's say, we're diagnosed with a very serious disease, or someone close to us dies, or our life is suddenly threatened in a close accident in a car. And it's often in moments like that that suddenly we become aware of how enormously nourished and inspired we are by being alive at all. And my sense is that the Dharma practice is basically the practice of learning how to flourish fully as a person and as a community. It's a process of flourishing. And this is a way in which nowadays we translate the Greek word eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. Are you familiar with this word? Eudaimonia. Eudaimonia was considered to be the purpose of philosophy in the ancient world. Everyone from Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, the purpose of philosophy was the good life. It's often translated. But I think what that means is our capacity to live fully, to flourish as the kinds of persons we aspire to be. And the Eightfold Path, in that sense, is basically a way of describing a flourishing life. A life in which we flourish in all areas of our humanity. But again, we'll come to that later down the road. But it's worth pointing out that this discussion of mindfulness and everything that we do in the next 2 or 3 days can all be understood as skills, practices that enable us to become more alive, to become more the person we aspire to be, to lead a good and rich life. Which, another way of putting that is to think of this practice as the practice of ethics. Ethics not as simply following rules, which is more morality, I think, but ethics as the cultivation of character. Again, in the Greek, ethos means character. And to train one's character is essentially to cultivate and to develop oneself. You may not like an aspect of your character, which is, say, very greedy or shy, perhaps. And we then work on ourselves in such a way, whether it be through philosophy or religion or MBSR or whatever it might be, in such a way that we free ourselves from what seems to diminish our lives and to create the space in our experience to bring those qualities that make us feel more alive into reality. So mindfulness is therefore one of those practices that can free us to become more fully the person we aspire to be. The very first image that we find in the Buddha's account of mindfulness is of a person, in this case, a monk, but obviously since he also had female monastics at that time, the monk is just an example. It means a person or a practitioner goes into a forest and sits at the foot of a tree or sits in an empty hut and makes their back upright, sits cross-legged, and puts their attention onto what's called the Mukha in Pali, which means the openings of the mouth and the nose. This is probably the earliest recorded example of a meditation instruction, certainly within the Buddhist tradition, but perhaps even further than that, I don't know. So again, we get here a very, very concrete image that I think, is a very, very helpful one. To cultivate mindfulness or meditation in the broader sense, as the lady asked this morning, we need to step aside from our ordinary everyday lives. In other words, our home or just our office where we work, and create a space, whether it's in a corner of a room or in our garden or on a retreat like this, where we can, for a while, not be driven by the concerns that usually drive us. So the idea of going into a forest and sitting at the root of a tree. And again, I particularly am drawn to the idea that we return to the natural world. We go into nature. And I don't think it's a coincidence that monasteries and hermitages and retreat centers tend to be in nature, like here, for example. Might be a bad internet connection, but it's very good for cultivating mindfulness. And then what does the Buddha say? The Buddha says, when the practitioner breathes out a long breath, he knows I'm breathing out a long breath. When he breathes in a short breath, he knows that he's breathing in a short breath. That's it. There's no further instruction. That's all that is stated. And again, I think that this enormous simplicity is also enormously difficult to do. It's easy for me to say this. It's another thing altogether to be able to do it. And so in the very, very almost banal expression, when he breathes out a long breath, he knows he's breathing out a long breath. And you might go, duh. In fact, it's pointing to quite a significant shift in our quality of attention. Because normally when we breathe out a long breath, unless it's a really long breath, we don't notice that much either. So now we're actually paying close attention to the very basics of our own life. Then the Buddha gives an example. He says, just as a skilled wood turner, you know what a wood turner is? A Drechsler, genau. Just as a skilled Drechsler or wood turner with his lathe, when he makes a short turn, he knows he's making a short turn. And when he makes a long turn, he knows that he's making a long turn. It's a very strange example to use for a basic practice of meditation. But if we think about it, I think it is very revealing. It points out that the kind of attention that we find with the Drechsler, with the wood turner, is not an attention in which the wood turner is separate from his lathe, his tools, his workshop, but he's actually intimately engaged with his machinery and is interacting with it with his whole body. And this is a kind of, he acquires a kind of what we call in French a savoir-faire. A savoir-faire. He knows how to do something as opposed to knowing about something. This is a distinction we also find in the American philosopher John Dewey, who talks about knowing how and knowing that. So I can give you all sorts of information about Buddhist theories about mindfulness, but that's not savoir-faire. That's not going to give you a knowledge of how to do those things. It's just going to give you lots of information about them, which could be very useful, of course. But it's a totally different quality of savoir, of knowing. You don't know with your body, through your limbs, through your hands, through your feet, through your alignment with a tool, through your manipulation of a piece of wood. The image the Buddha gives is quite different from the idea we often have of meditation, in which you somehow step back and you look neutrally and passively at what is going on. I think that is part of it, but it's also a form of engaging with our experience in a different way. So it's not just when the meditator breathes out a long breath, he knows he breathes out a long breath. That's really where you begin. But in doing so, you open yourself to experience your breathing from the perspective of your whole body. Particularly if you're doing this exercise, sitting down on the floor, having calmed your mind, you then enter into a relationship with your own experience that can be transformative, which is exactly what the Drexler example shows. He starts with an uncarved piece of wood and he turns it and he works it so that it's transformed from just an ordinary piece of wood into, let's say, a bowl or a table leg, whatever it might be. So this suggests to me very much that the practice of mindfulness is not just looking at things more carefully, but it's actually about the way we work with things. And in this case, we work with the materials, not of wood or clay. We work with the materials of our own being. We are the workshop. Our fears and our desires and our aches and our pains and our memories and our plans, this is the raw material that we work, as it were, with the tools that we're going to be exploring over the next days. I find these analogies, these metaphors, like a wood turner, almost more powerful than Buddhist philosophy, analytic descriptions and analysis of the nature of mind and all those sorts of things. Again, can be very useful, but they don't have the power of parable or metaphor. So if that image has struck you, then go back to it and let yourself sit with some of this imagery, some of these pictures, very often taken from the work of artisans. It's not just wood turners the Buddha speaks of when he's giving examples. It's goldsmiths, it's farmers, it's carpenters, fisher people. And this to me points to how the wisdom of the tradition. It's not a sort of rather abstract and mystical kind of vision of something, but it's more like the wisdom of savoir-faire, the wisdom of knowing how to do things rather than knowing what things are. It's not ontological, it's pragmatic kind of knowledge. But as this practice of mindfulness develops, we move on away from the breath and the physical sensations in the body, and we begin to be more attuned to how we feel. How we feel. And feeling, in this sense, is again a very important area of our experience to open up. We all know what the word means. We all know what it's like to feel pleasure, what it's like to feel pain. But in between pleasure and pain, there's a whole spectrum of feelings that are much less easy to identify and to name. So when the Buddha speaks of becoming aware of feelings, he's trying to make us more conscious of this range of emotions and moods that is constantly present within us. Sometimes it's strong, and so we notice it, and we often immediately react to it. At other times, it's more subtle. It's that curious sense we have of feeling a certain way. And it's something that I can remember from being a young child that I was always very puzzled about. I feel a certain way. That is so often what I'm mainly concerned about in my life. How do I feel? Do I feel okay, or do I feel, distressed or unhappy or anxious? And yet I remember at school, when I was probably only 7 or 8 years old, I couldn't understand why nobody ever talked about this. We'll be taught about history and geography and English literature and mathematics, all of these things. But the thing that people were really concerned about, at least I was, that was taboo, verboten. You just don't talk about those things. And one of the things that really drew me into Buddhism as a young person was precisely because here were a bunch of people who did talk about such things. And they talked about them with great precision and understanding, and moreover, provided exercises and practices whereby you could actually work with these feelings. I mean, I think nowadays, much of this is the sphere of psychotherapy, which I think has done, enormous good in allowing us tools whereby to work with our feelings and with our fears and our emotions and so on. But back in the 1960s, primary school in England hadn't yet got there. So feeling. So again, I'm not going to say a great deal about this. This is a topic my wife, Martine, is very interested in. She's written about it. But just to flag the fact that mindfulness is about our physical sensations, it's about our breath, it's about those things, but it also then becomes more and more to do with how we feel, being mindful of our feelings, and also mindful of the feelings of others, not just one's own, but to attune oneself perhaps to better recognize and respond to how others are feeling. That's equally part of this practice. And similarly to become more attentive to our states of mind that may not necessarily be feelings or emotional, but in particular, when we come to this aspect of mindfulness, the Buddha suggests that we pay attention to the contractions and the expansions within our mind. By contraction, I mean the tendency of a mental state to become primarily concerned about what I want or what I'm afraid of or how important I am, my own kind of egocentric experience, which has a kind of contracting effect. But we also have times in our lives in which we let go of that self-centeredness and we open ourselves to other people, other forms of life, the environment, in which we feel a much greater expansion, a movement towards generosity, a movement towards love, a movement towards acceptance and tolerance, a movement towards kindness. So being mindful of mind is to be mindful of the movements of mind that either contract us or expand us, to become more sensitized to these differences. We'll come back later to where that is significant in other areas of this path, but for the moment we'll leave it there. And the fourth mindfulness, which is one that is even in Buddhist circles not really talked about very much, is called Dharma Nupasana, which means paying close attention to the Dharma, the teachings, this tricky word. What did I say? I've lost my thought. Dharma, this tricky word, Dharma. I think what this means here is simply bearing in mind instructions and teachings that help us in our practice. So a very simple example would be while we were sitting this morning, halfway through the meditation, I said, if you get distracted, come back to the breath. If you get distracted, come back to the breath. Now that is basically an instruction. It's a suggestion. If X, then Y. If you're feeling distracted, then come back to the breath. And what we do over time in meditation is internalize instructions. So when we start the practice of meditation, it might feel a little bit artificial. He said, when I'm distracted, I come back to the breath. Okay, I'm distracted, I'll come back to the breath. And we can do that, but it's like a kind of an exercise that doesn't really have much bearing on, our broader experience. It's just a tool, perhaps. But the more we do this, we find that we no longer have to repeat those words like I did this morning. We internalize them to the point that they become naturalized. So once we get used to this sort of practice, when we get distracted, we come back to the breath. But we don't have to actually, verbalize that. It just becomes what we do. And that's true of any kind of training in any skill at all. Playing the piano, you have to do lots of boring things before you can play the later Beethoven sonatas. Same with this. You have to do a lot of boring things, like endlessly coming back to the breath, before it becomes a naturalized skill, something that you can incorporate in just how you are with yourself. I'm going to stop here. We've covered in brief these four mindfulnesses, and we can explore that further as we discuss during these next days. But I hope I've given you a picture of where I'm going and how we're going to proceed. And remember, all of these things are also part of the Eightfold Path. Mindfulness is again listed in the Eightfold Path as part and parcel of what it means to flourish as a human being. Okay, the silence is now over for today until this evening. We're going to have coffee, and I guess that's upstairs. So we have 30 minutes of coffee and break. You can do what you want. And we'll meet back here in 30 minutes, and we'll open this up for discussion, and then we'll conclude with a sitting before lunch. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody online.